Two empires clash in the frozen landscape of Manchuria. Soldiers in khaki uniforms advance across snowy terrain. Artillery thunders. Men fall. But this is not Europe. This is not the Western Front. This is 1904. This is Asia. And it's shocking the world. Because for the first time in centuries, a non-Western nation is defeating a European great power. Japan, a nation that had been medieval just 30 years earlier, is defeating Russia, a massive European empire. The world watches in amazement. How is this possible? How can Japan compete with Russia? But Japan is competing. Japan is winning. Japan is proving that Western dominance is not inevitable. The Russo-Japanese War lasted just 18 months, but it changed the world fundamentally. This was not merely a regional conflict. This was a watershed moment, a turning point that would reshape global politics for the entire 20th century. The war revealed that the Western-dominated world order was fragile, that non-Western nations could modernize, could industrialize, could challenge European supremacy. Today, we're going to explore 15 reasons why the Russo-Japanese War happened, why it mattered so profoundly, why it changed the trajectory of human history. The truth explains not just a war, but a turning point in world history. A moment when the balance of global power began to shift irreversibly. Reason 15. Japan's rapid modernization. From medieval to modern in 30 years. 35 years before the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was completely medieval. Samurai ruled, feudalism dominated. Technology was centuries behind the West. The country had been deliberately isolated from the outside world for over 200 years. But then, in 1868, something extraordinary happened. The Meiji Restoration transformed Japan overnight. A young emperor, just a figurehead before, suddenly became the symbol of a complete national transformation. Japan made a deliberate decision: become modern or be conquered. There was no middle ground. Japan imported Western technology aggressively. Japanese studied in Western universities, learned Western science, brought back Western knowledge. Japan built factories at an unprecedented rate, constructed railroads that connected the entire nation, built ports that could handle modern shipping. Japan created a modern military from scratch, built a navy based on British designs, organized an army based on German organization. But this transformation was not merely technical. It was psychological. The entire Japanese nation mobilized behind modernization. Every resource went to development. Every policy aimed at catching up with the West. In 35 years, Japan had accomplished what took Europe centuries to achieve. Japan became a modern industrial nation, a military power, a regional force to be reckoned with. But modernization creates something unexpected. It creates ambition, and ambition creates conflict. Japan now had the military capability to challenge other powers in Asia. Japan wanted to prove itself equal to Western powers, wanted to establish itself as the dominant regional superpower, wanted to show the world that Japan was no longer a medieval backwater, was now a player in global politics. This rapid modernization was the essential foundation of the war. Without modernization, war would have been impossible. Reason 14. Russian expansion into Manchuria. The bear moving eastward. Russia, in the late 1800s, was expanding with deliberate purpose eastward. Russia is the largest nation on Earth, but it wanted more. Wanted warm water ports that wouldn't freeze in winter. Wanted access to the Pacific Ocean. Wanted to establish itself as a Pacific power. Russia built the Trans-Siberian Railway, an engineering marvel that connected Moscow to the Pacific Ocean across thousands of kilometers of wilderness. This railway was not built for commercial purposes. It was built for military purposes, to project Russian power into Asia. Russia also wanted Manchuria. This vast region was rich in resources. It was strategically positioned. Control of Manchuria would make Russia the dominant power in East Asia. Russia wanted Korea. This peninsula was the gateway to the sea. Control of Korea would give Russia a warm water port. Russia's expansion was methodical, deliberate, designed to make Russia the master of East Asia. This expansion directly threatened Japan's most fundamental interests. Japan, surrounded by powerful neighbors, felt increasingly threatened by Russian expansion. Japan is an island nation. It has no natural hinterland. If Russia controlled Manchuria and Korea, Japan would be surrounded, hemmed in completely, unable to expand. unable to breathe. For Japan, the Russian advance into Manchuria was an existential threat. If Russia continued this expansion unchecked, Japan would gradually be pushed into irrelevance. Japan and Russia had fundamentally incompatible ambitions in East Asia. One would have to back down. One would have to sacrifice its interests, or they would go to war. Reason 13. Competition for Korea. The prize that both wanted desperately. Korea was the key point of conflict between Japan and Russia. Korea was strategically located between Japan and mainland Asia. Control of Korea would give enormous strategic advantage to whoever possessed it. Japan wanted Korea as a client state, a buffer between Japan and the vast Eurasian continent. Japan wanted Korea to be dependent on Japan, economically dependent, militarily dependent, politically dependent. Russia wanted Korea as part of its Far Eastern expansion, wanted to make Korea a Russian sphere of influence. Russia wanted a warm water port on the Korean peninsula. The two powers maneuvered for influence in Korea constantly. Japan tried to make Korea dependent on Japan, sent advisors, sent military officers, tried to control Korean policy. Russia tried to make Korea dependent on Russia, sent its own advisors, tried to counter Japanese influence. By 1904, Japanese patience had worn out completely. Japan had negotiated with Russia for years, but Russia refused to recognize Japan's special interest in Korea. Japan decided that negotiation had failed, that military force was the only language Russia understood. Japan made a fateful decision. If Russia would not cede Korea peacefully, Japan would take it by force. Reason 12. The failure of diplomacy. Talking didn't solve anything. Japan and Russia had been negotiating over spheres of influence since 1895. They negotiated in secret. They negotiated openly. They negotiated for years without reaching agreement. But neither side was willing to compromise on fundamentals. Russia wanted Manchuria and Korea under Russian influence, was not willing to negotiate away Manchuria. Japan wanted at least Korea, would accept Russian influence in Manchuria if Russia acknowledged Japanese dominance in Korea. These positions were incompatible. There was no middle ground that both sides could accept. The fundamental question was, who would dominate East Asia, Russia or Japan? Only one power could be dominant. Both could not share dominance. As negotiations dragged on without resolution, Japanese impatience grew exponentially. Military hardliners in Japan pushed for war, argued forcefully that Russia would never compromise, argued that Russia was simply buying time, using negotiations to delay while Russia strengthened its position in the Far East, argued that waiting only gave Russia more time to send troops, to build fortifications, to prepare for war. Eventually, after years of fruitless negotiations, Japanese patience broke completely. The Japanese government concluded that war was inevitable, that negotiation was pointless, that the only way to resolve the conflict was through military force. Reason 11. Russian overconfidence. We are too strong for Japan. Russian military leadership was contemptuous of Japan. Russian generals and admirals viewed Japan as a second-rate power, as an upstart nation that had no right to challenge Russia. Russian officers had fought in Europe, had experience with great power warfare. They were confident of their superiority. Russian leaders believed that if war came, Russia would easily defeat Japan, would crush Japanese forces. Russia had vastly more territory than Japan, more population, more natural resources, more industrial capacity, more everything. Russia seemed obviously stronger on every metric. By simple military logic, Russia should have overwhelmed Japan. But this overconfidence led Russia to make catastrophic mistakes. Russia didn't modernize rapidly, didn't concentrate forces in the Far East, didn't prepare adequately for war. Russian military leaders assumed that when war came, they could dispatch Japanese forces without much difficulty, assumed that Japanese soldiers couldn't match Russian soldiers, that Japanese officers couldn't match Russian officers. This overconfidence was a critical miscalculation, perhaps the fatal miscalculation. Russia entered the war unprepared, undermanned, underestimating its opponent. Reason 10. Japan's first strike advantage. Striking before the enemy is ready. Japan made the strategic decision to attack Russia before Russia was fully prepared. On February 8, 1904, Japanese destroyers attacked Russian warships at Port Arthur, the main Russian naval base in the Far East. This was a surprise attack. Russia wasn't expecting war, wasn't prepared for immediate combat. The attack damaged Russian ships and destroyed Russian military plans for the defense of Manchuria. Japan followed with a full invasion of Manchuria. Japanese forces landed. Japanese armies advanced. By striking first, by attacking before Russia could mobilize its vast resources, Japan gained a critical advantage. Japan struck while Russia was unprepared. While Russian forces in the Far East were limited, the Trans-Siberian Railway was still incomplete. Russian reinforcements couldn't reach the Far East quickly. This first strike advantage was crucial to Japan's entire war strategy. If Japan had waited, Russia would have completed the Trans-Siberian Railway, would have fortified Manchuria completely, would have sent more forces to the Far East. But Japan attacked immediately, caught Russia off guard, didn't allow Russia time to prepare. The first strike advantage gave Japan a window of opportunity, a limited time window in which Japan could achieve objectives before Russian resources overwhelmed Japanese forces. Reason 9. Logistical advantage for Japan. Proximity matters in war more than anything. Japan fought the war in Manchuria. Japan is close to Manchuria, geographically adjacent. Russia fought the war in Manchuria. Russia is very far from Manchuria, thousands of kilometers away across wilderness. This logistical difference was enormous, perhaps the most important difference in the entire war. Japanese troops could be reinforced quickly. Supplies could be sent across short distances. Wounded could be evacuated quickly to hospitals. Japanese supply lines were short, efficient, reliable. Russian supplies had to travel thousands of kilometers, had to be shipped across the Trans-Siberian Railway. The railway was incomplete. Russian supplies had to travel for weeks or months to reach the front. Russian troops had to march thousands of kilometers to reach Manchuria. Suffered terrible losses from disease and exhaustion. Russian reinforcements took months to arrive. By the time they arrived, situations had changed. Battles had been decided. The logistical advantage favored Japan immensely. A nation fighting far from home is always at disadvantage. Has to supply troops across vast distances. Has to send replacements across vast distances. Russia learned this lesson painfully in Manchuria. Reason 8. Japanese military competence. The army that was better trained. Japanese military officers had studied modern warfare intensively, had trained in modern tactics deliberately. Japanese military officers had gone to Europe, had studied with German officers, had learned the latest military theory. Japanese soldiers, though poorly paid and treated harshly, were disciplined, well-trained, motivated. Japanese forces were organized efficiently, commanded well by officers who understood modern warfare. Russian forces, by contrast, were often poorly organized, commanded by incompetent officers. Russian generals had no experience with modern warfare, had never fought against an Asian power, assumed that Russian military superiority was automatic, didn't prepare adequately. Russian soldiers were conscripts, often unhappy, sometimes unreliable, didn't understand why they were fighting in Manchuria. On the battlefield, Japanese forces consistently outmaneuvered Russian forces. Japanese tactics were superior. Japanese soldiers were better trained. Japanese discipline was superior. Japanese competence was superior. Reason 7. The Battle of Tsushima. Japan's overwhelming naval victory that decided everything. The war's ultimate turning point came at sea, not on land. In May 1905, the Japanese and Russian fleets fought at Tsushima Strait, between Korea and Japan. The battle lasted 2 days, but it determined the entire war. The Russian fleet had sailed from Europe, had traveled all the way around Africa, had sailed across the Indian Ocean, had come to fight in the Far East. The Japanese fleet waited patiently for the Russians to arrive. When the Russians arrived, exhausted from the long voyage, the Japanese attacked. Japan devastated the Russian fleet completely, sank Russian battleships, destroyed Russian naval power, captured Russian vessels. Russia lost nearly its entire Pacific fleet. With naval superiority, Japan could cut off Russian supply lines, could prevent Russian reinforcements, could blockade Russian ports. The naval victory was decisive, absolute, complete. After Tsushima, Russia could not continue the war, could not maintain supply lines, could not send reinforcements. Japan had won the war at sea, and therefore had won the war entirely. Reason 6. Russian domestic instability. The bear was falling apart at home. While Russia fought Japan abroad, Russia was collapsing at home. Industrial strikes, worker unrest, revolutionary activity, all intensifying. The war was unpopular among Russian civilians. People questioned why Russia was fighting an Asian power, questioned why Russian soldiers were dying in Manchuria. The war drained the Russian economy. War spending was enormous. Taxes were increased. The burden fell on ordinary Russians. The economy was strained to the breaking point. Inflation was rampant. Food was scarce. Revolution was brewing. The Russian people were angry. Angry at the war. Angry at the government. Angry at the Tsar. In 1905, the Russian Revolution nearly overthrew the Tsar completely. Workers went on strike. Soldiers refused orders. The government nearly collapsed. The Tsar, desperate to end the war, desperate to focus on the revolution at home, agreed to peace negotiations. The Tsar could not fight a war abroad and a revolution at home simultaneously. Russia simply could not continue the war, while revolution threatened the entire government. Reason 5. American mediation, the peace broker who changed everything. After Japan's naval victory, peace negotiations began. But Japan and Russia weren't negotiating directly. They were negotiating through an intermediary. President Theodore Roosevelt of the United States offered to mediate. Roosevelt wanted to prevent Japan from becoming too dominant in Asia, wanted to preserve balance in Asia. Roosevelt wanted Russia to remain a power in Asia to counterbalance Japan. Roosevelt negotiated the Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The treaty ended the war. But on terms that surprised the world, Russia kept much of Manchuria, Japan gained Korea and southern Sakhalin Island. Neither side got everything they wanted. Both sides got something. Japan got what it had fought for, dominance in Korea. Russia retained presence in Manchuria, retained status as a Pacific power. The treaty satisfied neither side completely, but satisfied both sides enough to end the war. Reason 4. The global shock. A non-Western nation defeated a European great power. The world was amazed, shocked. Some were horrified. Japan had defeated Russia, a major European power, a power that had seemed clearly superior. This challenged the fundamental assumption that Western nations were inherently superior to non-Western nations. It showed that non-Western nations could modernize, could become military powers, could defeat Europeans in open combat. The shock reverberated globally. Across every continent, colonial peoples everywhere saw in Japan's victory a message. European dominance is not inevitable. Europe is not invincible. If Japan could defeat Russia, perhaps other nations could defeat their European overlords. This inspired independence movements across Asia and Africa, inspired nationalist movements in India, Indonesia, the Philippines. Throughout the colonial world, Japan's victory signaled the beginning of the end of European global dominance. The 20th century would see the collapse of European empires, the rise of non-Western nations. That process began with Japan's victory over Russia. Reason 3. The rise of Japanese imperialism. Japan becomes an imperial power in its own right. After defeating Russia, Japan felt emboldened. Japan annexed Korea in 1910, made it a Japanese colony, began the process of assimilating Korea into the Japanese Empire. Japan continued expanding, took the Mariana Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Palau Islands. Japanese corporations began exploiting resources throughout East Asia. Japanese immigrants began settling throughout the region. By the 1930s, Japan was an imperial power in its own right, a power comparable to the European colonial powers. Japan would eventually seek dominance over all of East Asia. This would lead to the invasion of China in 1937, would lead to conflict with the United States, and eventually would lead to Japan's entry into World War II. The Russo-Japanese War was the beginning of Japan's imperial ambitions, the first step on a path that would ultimately lead to Japan's militarism and aggression in the 1930s. Reason 2. The decline of Russia, a defeated power with massive consequences. Russia's defeat to Japan was traumatic for the Russian nation. Russia, a huge continental empire, had been defeated by an island nation, by Japan. By a nation that Russia had viewed as primitive, the defeat was humiliating, embarrassing, shocking to Russian pride. The defeat weakened the Tsar's authority at home. The Russian government had promised victory, had promised easy victory. Instead, Russia had suffered defeat, had suffered massive losses, had achieved nothing. The humiliation contributed directly to the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Tsar's authority never recovered from the Russo-Japanese War. The loss of naval dominance shifted the balance of power in Asia fundamentally. Russia withdrew from East Asia, focused on Europe, ceded dominance of East Asia to Japan. This retreat would have massive consequences in World War II. Reason 1. The transformation of world order. The end of Western dominance began here. The Russo-Japanese War was a pivotal moment in world history. It marked the beginning of the end of Western dominance. After 1905, the world knew that non-Western nations could compete militarily with Western powers. This inspired nationalist movements globally. This emboldened colonial peoples to resist European rule. This challenged the assumption that Western civilization was inherently superior. The war didn't immediately overturn the world order, but it signaled its eventual overthrow. The world order of 2024, where non-Western nations are major powers, began with Japan's victory in 1905. The 20th century would see the rise of Japan, the rise of China, the rise of India, the decline of Europe, the collapse of European empires. All of this began with the Russo-Japanese War.